Long before Japan emerged as the rich, vibrant nation we recognize today, the islands were quietly cradling a unique and ancient story. The land, lush with forests, mountains and coastline, has always been home to people who lived closely with nature. These early inhabitants arrived thousands of years ago, long before recorded history, leaving behind only traces of their existence. Imagine a time when the world was still young, and human life was as much about survival as it was about understanding the mysteries of the environment. These were the very first steps in the formation of Japan. The earliest known people to inhabit Japan arrived during the Paleolithic period, over 30,000 years ago. At this time, humans were living in small, scattered groups, hunting animals and gathering plants to survive. Life was hard, and the people were constantly moving, following the food sources and adapting to the changing seasons. It's said that these early humans were resourceful, crafting tools from stone, bone, and wood to help with hunting, fishing, and gathering. They left behind these tools, which give us the faintest glimpse of their lives. Some archaeologists believe that they also created artwork in the form of simple carvings, although much of it is speculative due to the limited evidence. The early inhabitants of Japan were likely nomadic, moving from place to place and adapting to their surroundings. Their shelters were likely simple, temporary structures, possibly built from wood or animal skins, and their clothing would have been made from materials such as animal hides and plant fibers. They relied heavily on the land for food, hunting game like deer, boar, and bears, while also gathering fruits, nuts, and fish from the abundant rivers and coasts. The ocean was a major source of sustenance, and fishing likely played a key role in their survival. As time passed, the climate of Japan changed, gradually warming up and creating more favorable conditions for agriculture. This shift marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Japan, the arrival of the Jomon people. The Jomon period, which began around 14,000 BCE, was a time of profound change. These people were not only skilled hunters and gatherers, but they also began to settle down in one place, developing the earliest forms of agriculture. The Jomon people began to domesticate plants like acorns and wild grasses, which allowed them to stay in one location for longer periods of time. They started to build permanent homes, which were often semi-subterranean and made from wood and thatch, offering shelter from the cold winters. What makes the Jomon period particularly remarkable is the advent of pottery. These early potters created intricate, beautifully crafted pots, which have been discovered in abundance by modern archaeologists. The pottery of the Jomon people is among the oldest in the world, and it offers a glimpse into the daily life and beliefs of the time. The designs on these pots were often geometric, but some featured animal motifs, hinting at a deep connection to nature. These pots were used for cooking, storing food, and ceremonial purposes. The act of creating pottery was not just functional, but it was an expression of culture and identity. Pottery was important to the Jomon people's way of life, and it played a role in many rituals and ceremonies. The Jomon people also engaged in early forms of art and ritual, often crafting small figurines, known as dogo. These figurines, typically made from clay, are thought to have been used in religious or spiritual practices. Some scholars believe they may have been representations of fertility or the human form, while others think they could have served as symbols for healing or protection. The existence of these figurines suggests that the Jomon people had a complex spiritual world, one that went beyond mere survival and into the realm of the metaphysical. Throughout the Jomon period, Japan's natural environment played a significant role in shaping the culture and lifestyle of its people. The dense forests, mountains, and coastlines were not just backdrops to their lives, they were deeply intertwined with their identity. The Jomon people's connection to the land is evident in their reliance on fishing, hunting, and gathering, as well as in their art and religious practices. The natural world was revered, and it was a place of both sustenance and spiritual significance. However, despite the many advances of the Jomon people, their lifestyle would soon be transformed by the arrival of a new group of settlers, the Yayoi people. The Yayoi period, which began around 300 BCE, marked a dramatic shift in the way of life in Japan. Unlike the Jomon people, the Yayoi brought with them advanced agricultural practices, most notably the cultivation of rice. This was a game-changer for the people of Japan. Rice farming allowed for a more settled way of life, where communities could grow food in one place, rather than constantly moving in search of game or edible plants. This new method of agriculture allowed the population to grow, and it led to the development of villages and towns, marking the start of more complex societal structures. The arrival of the Yayoi people is believed to have been a gradual process, with people migrating from the Asian mainland, likely from China or Korea. Archaeological evidence shows that the Yayoi brought with them knowledge of rice cultivation, metalworking, and other advanced technologies. Rice particularly became the cornerstone of Japanese agriculture, and its cultivation spread rapidly across the islands. As the Yayoi people mastered rice farming, they were able to produce surplus food, which led to the growth of larger settlements and the rise of social hierarchies. The ability to store food for times of scarcity also helped to stabilize communities. In addition to rice, the Yayoi people also introduced other innovations, such as the use of bronze and iron. These metals were used to create tools and weapons, which made farming and other activities more efficient. The Yayoi people were skilled in metalworking, and the artifacts they left behind, including swords, tools, and jewelry, show a high degree of craftsmanship. The introduction of metalworking also led to the development of trade networks, as people exchanged goods like salt, food, and tools. The Yayoi were not isolated. They were part of a larger network of cultures that stretched across Asia, and their interactions with neighboring regions shaped the development of Japan. The arrival of the Yayoi people marked the end of the Jomon period and the beginning of a new era in Japan's history. The changes brought about by the Yayoi were profound, affecting everything from the way people lived to the way they thought about the world around them. The Yayoi were more socially organized than the Jomon, and their societies began to develop complex structures, with leaders, followers, and warriors. The introduction of rice farming allowed for larger populations, and the emergence of social hierarchies began to lay the groundwork for the formation of early kingdoms. The Yayoi people's influence can still be seen today in the rice culture of Japan, which remains a central part of Japanese life. In this early chapter of Japan's history, the shift from a nomadic hunter-gatherer existence to a settled agricultural society was pivotal. The Jomon people laid the foundations for art, culture, and spiritual life, while the Yayoi people introduced new technologies and agricultural practices that would shape the future of Japan. These early settlers, with their deep connection to the land and their innovative spirit, set the stage for the development of a unique and enduring culture that would continue to evolve for centuries. Looking back at these early periods, we can see the roots of what would eventually become one of the world's most fascinating and influential cultures. The story of Japan's ancient people, their struggles, their triumphs, and their creativity, is one that continues to inspire and inform the world today. This is only the beginning of a long and complex history, but it is the foundation upon which everything else was built. The story of Japan, from its earliest days to its rise as a powerful nation, begins in these distant prehistoric times, a time when the land was wild and the future was full of possibility. The Yayoi period, spanning from around 300 BC to 300 CE, represents a pivotal moment in Japan's early history. This was a time of transformation as the early settlers of the islands began to adopt new technologies, social structures, and cultural practices. Life during this period was significantly different from the earlier Jomon era, and it marked the beginning of a more organized, settled way of life. It was in this period that the foundations of Japanese society were truly laid, setting the stage for the emergence of the first early states. The Yayoi people, who are believed to have migrated from the Asian mainland, brought with them the knowledge of rice farming, which revolutionized the agricultural practices of the Japanese islands. Rice was not just a crop, it became the cornerstone of Japanese society, shaping its culture, economy, and even religion. The Yayoi people cultivated rice in paddies, which required a level of organization and community cooperation that had not been needed in the earlier Jomon period. This form of agriculture allowed for food surpluses, which in turn led to population growth and the rise of larger, more complex communities. Rice farming also led to the development of permanent settlements, as people no longer needed to roam in search of food. Villages began to appear across the islands, and with them, the structure of society began to change. These early settlements were often located near rivers, which provided access to water for irrigation as well as routes for trade. Over time, these villages grew into towns, and the landscape of Japan began to transform into one of more permanent agricultural societies. In addition to rice, the Yayoi people introduced new technologies that further shaped the course of Japan's development. One of the most significant innovations was the use of metalworking. The Yayoi people brought with them knowledge of bronze and iron, materials that were essential for creating tools, weapons, and other artifacts. The introduction of bronze allowed the Yayoi to create more durable and effective farming tools, such as plows and sickles, which made rice cultivation easier and more efficient. Iron was used to create stronger weapons, such as swords and spears, and it played a crucial role in the development of early Japanese military culture. These metals were not only used for practical purposes, but also for artistic expression, with metalwork becoming an important part of Yayoi culture. The use of metal tools also facilitated the development of more specialized labor. With the rise of agriculture and surplus food production, people could specialize in different trades, such as pottery, weaving, and metalworking. This led to the growth of a more complex economy, one that went beyond simple subsistence farming. Some villages became centers of trade, where people exchanged goods such as pottery, textiles, tools, and food. Trade networks expanded, linking different regions of Japan and even reaching parts of the Asian mainland. The Yayoi people were not isolated. They were part of a larger cultural and economic exchange that spanned across East Asia. The rise of these early settlements and the increased specialization of labor also contributed to the development of social hierarchies. As villages grew larger and more complex, there was a need for leaders to organize and oversee the community. This marked the beginning of social stratification in Japan. The early Yayoi society was likely divided into different classes, with leaders, artisans, farmers, and laborers. The leaders were probably tribal chieftains or clan heads who held power over the distribution of resources and the defense of their communities. These leaders may have been chosen based on their lineage, strength, or skill in battle, but over time, leadership likely became more institutionalized, with hereditary rulers emerging. One of the most significant developments during the Yayoi period was the emergence of large, fortified settlements known as yama-ichi, or settlement mounds. These large villages, often surrounded by ditches or earthen walls, served as centers of power and defense. They were likely the homes of local leaders, who ruled over smaller surrounding villages. The presence of these fortifications suggests that warfare was becoming more common, and the rise of powerful clans necessitated the protection of territory. The fortified settlements were not only military strongholds, but also hubs of economic and cultural activity. They were centers where goods were exchanged, ceremonies were held, and decisions were made. The Yayoi people also developed new forms of religious practice during this time. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Yayoi worshipped nature spirits and deities associated with agriculture and fertility. They built shrines and altars often located in natural settings, such as forests, rivers, and mountains, where they could connect with the forces of nature that they believed controlled their lives. The worship of rice deities was especially important, as rice was the foundation of their society. Rituals and ceremonies were performed to ensure good harvests and to honor the spirits of the land. Some historians believe that early Shinto practices, Japan's indigenous religion, began to take shape during this period. The Yayoi period also saw the beginning of cultural exchanges between Japan and the broader East Asian world. Evidence of trade with the Korean peninsula and China is abundant, with Yayoi artifacts showing influences from these regions. The Yayoi people were exposed to a variety of new technologies, artistic styles, and ideas, which influenced their own culture. For example, the Yayoi adopted the Chinese system of writing, although it was not used extensively at this time. The influence of Chinese and Korean culture also helped shape the early political and social systems of Japan, as the Yayoi were exposed to ideas about governance, religion, and technology that had developed on the mainland. One of the most significant cultural exchanges during the Yayoi period was the spread of Buddhism and Confucianism from China. Although Buddhism did not become widespread in Japan until much later, its early influence began during this period. Confucian ideas about family structure, government, and ethics also began to take root in Japan, influencing the way people thought about society and governance. The Yayoi period was a time of great change, as the people of Japan moved from a more primitive, nomadic way of life to a more organized, agricultural society. The introduction of rice farming, metalworking, and other innovations transformed the landscape and culture of the islands. As villages grew into towns and powerful clans began to emerge, the foundations of Japan's early states were being laid. The rise of these early states marked the beginning of a new chapter in Japan's history, one that would lead to the formation of a unified nation. Looking back at the Yayoi period, it's clear that this was a time of profound transformation for Japan. The people of this era laid the groundwork for many of the cultural, social, and political practices that would define Japan for centuries to come. From their innovations in agriculture and metalworking, to their complex social structures and cultural exchanges with neighboring regions, the Yayoi period was a time of immense change and growth. The legacy of the Yayoi people continues to influence Japan today, from the importance of rice in Japanese culture to the country's enduring connection to the larger East Asian world. As the Yayoi period came to a close, Japan was on the cusp of a new era. The next chapter in the country's history, the Kofun period, would see the rise of powerful kingdoms and the beginning of the imperial system that still exists in Japan today. That the foundations for this new era had been firmly established during the Yayoi period, when the people of Japan began to create a society that would endure for thousands of years. As the Yayoi period drew to a close, Japan was on the brink of a new and significant chapter in its history. The Kofun period, which spanned from around 300 CE to 710 CE, marked the emergence of more organized political structures and the rise of powerful clans that would eventually form the foundation of the Japanese state. The name Kofun refers to the large keyhole-shaped burial mounds that became one of the most defining features of this period. These massive tombs were not just the final resting places of important individuals, they symbolized the growing complexity of Japanese society, which was shifting towards centralization and hierarchical rule. The Kofun period is notable for the rise of the Yamato clan, a powerful family that began to dominate the central plains of Japan. The Yamato clan would eventually establish the first imperial dynasty of Japan, a lineage that continues to this day. But the path to their dominance was not easy, and it involved fierce competition from other clans and tribes spread across the archipelago. The Yamato clan's rise was a result of both military conquest and strategic alliances, as they sought to consolidate power and expand their influence. Over time, they were able to unite various regional groups and create a central government that would lay the groundwork for the imperial system. At the heart of the Yamato state's early power was the creation of a system of political and military authority. The Yamato clan controlled a vast network of smaller regional tribes and had strong influence over much of the Japanese mainland. While it's difficult to pinpoint exactly how the Yamato came to dominate their rivals, historians believe that they were able to build alliances through marriage, trade, and military strength. One of the most significant early steps in this process was the establishment of a centralized capital and a set of court rituals that would define the Yamato state's culture and governance. The key feature of the Kofun period was the construction of large burial mounds, or kofun, for the elites of society. These tombs, often constructed in the shape of keyholes, were reserved for powerful rulers and warriors. The size and complexity of these kofun burial mounds were a clear symbol of the status and power of the individuals buried within them. Archaeologists have uncovered numerous kofun throughout the country, many of which are decorated with intricate artifacts including bronze mirrors, weapons, and pottery. These burial sites provide valuable insights into the material culture of the time, offering a glimpse of the society's wealth and power. The artifacts found in these tombs also suggest that the ruling elites were heavily influenced by the cultures of the Korean peninsula and China, with many of the objects having been imported from these neighboring regions. The Kofun period was not just about power and burial practices, it was also a time of cultural exchange and the introduction of new technologies. One of the most significant influences on the Yamato state during this time was the introduction of advanced technology from the Korean peninsula and China. These innovations included the use of iron tools, improved agricultural techniques, and, most importantly, the introduction of Buddhism. Buddhism, which had first arrived in Korea from China, began to spread slowly across the Japanese islands during the Kofun period, although it would not become widely adopted until the following centuries. The introduction of Buddhism had a profound effect on Japanese culture and society. It introduced new religious ideas, philosophies, and practices, many of which would later be integrated into Japan's indigenous Shinto beliefs. This fusion of Buddhism and Shinto would come to define much of Japanese spiritual life in the centuries that followed. In the Kofun period, however, the primary focus of the elites remained on maintaining political power through military strength and the control of resources. The ruling Yamato clan was keenly aware of the growing power of neighboring kingdoms and the potential influence of foreign cultures, and so they worked to adapt and incorporate these influences into their own society. The political structure of the Yamato state continued to evolve over the course of the Kofun period. Initially, the Yamato clan operated as a powerful confederation of smaller tribal groups, each of which held its own territory and leadership. However, as the Yamato clan's power grew, they began to impose their authority over these smaller groups, creating a more centralized form of governance. This transition from a loose confederation to a centralized state was critical in shaping Japan's future political landscape. By the end of the Kofun period, the Yamato court had become the dominant political and cultural center of the archipelago. Alongside this political centralization, the Kofun period also saw the development of a more formalized social structure. The Yamato court had established a hierarchy of rulers and nobles, with powerful families holding key positions of authority. The social system was highly stratified, with a clear distinction between the ruling elites and the common people. The elites lived in fortified settlements and constructed large tombs, while the common people lived in smaller villages and worked the land. This division of society would continue to shape Japan's social structure for centuries to come. The Kofun period also saw the development of early Japanese writing systems, although it was still in its infancy. The use of Chinese characters began to make its way into Japan, primarily for religious and ceremonial purposes. These early written records were mostly used to document the achievements of the ruling elite and to record religious texts. As the Yamato court became more involved with China and the Korean peninsula, the use of written language would expand, eventually leading to the development of a distinct Japanese script. However, during the Kofun period, writing remained a tool primarily used by the elite for political and religious purposes, rather than a widespread means of communication. One of the most enduring legacies of the Kofun period was the establishment of the Yamato imperial family. The emperor or Tenno became the central figure in Japanese society, both as a political ruler and a spiritual leader. The role of the emperor was seen as divinely ordained, with the emperor believed to be a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, who was the central deity of the Shinto religion. This divine ancestry would become a key part of the emperor's legitimacy, reinforcing their position as the ultimate authority in Japan. The Yamato imperial family would continue to rule Japan for over 1,000 years, making it the oldest continuing hereditary monarchy in the world. By the end of the Kofun period, Japan had undergone a significant transformation. What had once been a collection of disparate tribes and communities had become a unified state under the rule of the Yamato clan. The formation of a centralized government, the establishment of a social hierarchy, and the introduction of new technologies and cultural practices laid the foundation for the future development of Japanese society. The Kofun period also marked the beginning of a shift from a primarily agrarian society to one that was increasingly urbanized and connected to the larger East Asian world. The Kofun period was a time of consolidation, innovation, and cultural exchange, setting the stage for the next era in Japanese history, the Asuka period. During the Asuka period, the Yamato state would continue to evolve, incorporating elements of Chinese governance and Buddhism, while also strengthening its own distinct identity. The transition from the Kofun period to the Asuka period marked the beginning of Japan's emergence as a more sophisticated, centralized state, one that would soon become a dominant force in East Asia. The Kofun period stands as one of the most critical eras in Japan's early history. It was a time when the seeds of Japanese culture, politics, and society were planted, and it laid the groundwork for the development of the Japanese imperial system that would shape the nation for centuries to come. The Asuka period, stretching from 550 CE to 710 CE, was a time of profound change and development for Japan. This era saw the rise of the Yamato court as the dominant force in Japanese politics, society, and culture, marking the transformation of Japan from a group of loosely connected tribes into a centralized state. The Asuka period is often recognized for the introduction of Buddhism, the establishment of a more formalized state structure, and the continued development of Japanese art and culture. It was during this time that Japan began to take shape as a nation-state, as it absorbed influences from neighboring regions like China and Korea, while simultaneously defining its own identity. At the beginning of the Asuka period, the Yamato clan, which had established its power in the Kofun period, was still the dominant force in Japan. However, the court was undergoing a transformation. The centralization of power, which had begun in the Kofun period, was further solidified during the Asuka period. The establishment of a more structured government, along with the introduction of new religious and cultural practices, marked the beginning of Japan's evolution into a sophisticated and unified state. One of the most significant events that occurred early in the Asuka period was the introduction of Buddhism to Japan in 50. Although there were likely earlier contacts with Buddhism through Korea, it was this particular moment that is often marked as the beginning of Buddhism's influence in Japan. The story goes that the king of Baekje, a kingdom on the Korean peninsula, sent a gift to the Yamato court in the form of a statue of the Buddha, along with sacred texts. This gift was intended as an offering to the Japanese court with the hope that the spiritual power of Buddhism would help strengthen the ruling dynasty. The introduction of Buddhism was initially met with resistance by some members of the Yamato court, especially from the influential Shinto priests and members of the royal family, who believed that Japan's native religion should remain unchallenged. However, despite early opposition, Buddhism began to take root in Japan, primarily through the efforts of powerful individuals like Prince Shotoku, a regent and statesman who is often credited with promoting the religion. Prince Shotoku, who became regent to the young Empress Suiko in the early 7th century, played a pivotal role in shaping Japan's transition to a more centralized and culturally sophisticated society. He was an avid supporter of Buddhism, and he worked to promote the religion through both political and religious means. Prince Shotoku also introduced reforms to the government, which would have a lasting impact on the structure of Japanese society. One of his most notable contributions was the establishment of the 17-article Constitution in 604 CE. This document, which was heavily influenced by Chinese Confucian and Buddhist thought, set forth principles of governance that emphasized the importance of harmony, respect for the emperor, and the centralization of political power. It also introduced a system of ranks and offices for government officials, which further reinforced the idea of a centralized state under the authority of the emperor. The 17-article Constitution was an important milestone in Japan's development, as it laid the groundwork for the country's future political and social structure. In addition to promoting Buddhism and creating the 17-article Constitution, Prince Shotoku worked to establish strong ties with the Tang dynasty of China, which was considered one of the most advanced and powerful civilizations of the time. Shotoku sent several diplomatic missions to China, and during these trips, Japanese emissaries were exposed to Chinese art, philosophy, technology, and governance. These exchanges with China were crucial in shaping the development of Japan's own political and cultural institutions. The introduction of Chinese characters and the adoption of Chinese-style governance were both important steps in the evolution of Japanese civilization. The court's adoption of Chinese models of governance, including the establishment of a centralized bureaucracy and a legal system based on Chinese Confucian principles, helped to solidify the emperor's authority and gave rise to a more organized and structured society. One of the key aspects of the Asuka period was the growth of the imperial court. The emperor's role became more formalized, and the establishment of a complex bureaucracy marked the beginning of Japan's imperial system, which would continue to evolve for centuries. As Japan increasingly adopted Chinese-style governance, the Yamato court began to model its own court rituals and ceremonies after those of China's Tang dynasty. The emperor became a figurehead of the state, surrounded by nobles and government officials who helped to administer the country. The development of this courtly culture was not just political, it was also cultural. During this period, the court became a center for artistic expression, where music, poetry, and other forms of artistic performance flourished. Japanese nobles began to commission works of art and literature, drawing inspiration from Chinese and Korean traditions, but also developing their own unique style. As the influence of Buddhism grew, so did its impact on the arts. Monasteries and temples were built across Japan, many of them modeled after those in China and Korea, but infused with distinct Japanese characteristics. The construction of temples such as Horyuji, one of the oldest wooden structures in the world, is a testament to the architectural achievements of the time. Buddhism brought with it a new artistic vocabulary, including intricate sculptures, paintings, and scrolls that depicted Buddhist deities and teachings. These works of art were not only religious symbols but also reflected the growing sophistication of Japanese society, as the court became more attuned to the finer aspects of culture and intellectual life. Despite the rapid advances in culture and governance during the Asuka period, Japan was still a society deeply rooted in its indigenous beliefs. Shinto, Japan's native religion, continued to play an important role in the lives of the people, even as Buddhism spread. The relationship between Shinto and Buddhism was complicated at first, with tensions arising between the two religious traditions. However, over time, Shinto and Buddhism began to merge in what is known as the Shinbutsu Shugo, or syncretism period. This blending of the two traditions laid the foundation for the complex spiritual landscape that Japan would embrace in the centuries to come. The Asuka period also saw the rise of important artistic and architectural developments that would leave a lasting legacy on Japanese culture. The construction of temples, the creation of religious artifacts, and the development of a distinct courtly aesthetic became defining features of this era. The fusion of Chinese, Korean, and Japanese artistic traditions led to the creation of a unique artistic style that was both highly refined and distinctly Japanese. By the end of the Asuka period, Japan had established itself as a unified state under the rule of the emperor. The political and cultural foundations for the imperial system had been laid, and the influence of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Chinese governance had begun to shape the country's future. The Asuka period marked the beginning of Japan's transformation into a more centralized and sophisticated society, setting the stage for the next great chapter in its history, the Nara period. The Nara period, which began in 710 CE, would see the formalization of many of the political, religious, and cultural institutions that were introduced during the Asuka period. It would be a time of consolidation and expansion, as Japan sought to further strengthen its central government and solidify its place in East Asia. But before that, the Asuka period stood as a crucial moment of transition, when Japan began to embrace new ideas, build new institutions, and forge a unique identity that would shape its future for centuries to come. The Nara period, spanning from 710 to 1794 CE, is considered a significant turning point in Japanese history. It was during this period that Japan's imperial system became more formalized, and the country's political, cultural, and religious institutions took their final shape. The capital city, Hyōkyō, modern-day Nara, was established as the first permanent capital of Japan, marking a new era in the country's governance. This period saw the solidification of the Japanese imperial system, the rise of Buddhism as a major influence in political life, and the establishment of a more centralized government that drew heavily from Chinese models. It was also a time of flourishing cultural activity, as Japan sought to create a unique identity that blended indigenous traditions with the influence of China and Korea. The Nara period was defined by the consolidation of imperial power. The emperor, who had been a figurehead during the Asuka period, began to exercise greater authority over the state. With the support of the imperial court, the emperor was able to create a more centralized bureaucracy and expand the scope of imperial rule. The government was modeled after the Chinese Tang dynasty, with a system of ranks and offices for court officials, many of whom were appointed based on merit rather than birth. This helped to create a more efficient and organized state, and it laid the groundwork for the political system that would endure throughout Japan's history. At the same time, the emperor's role as the divine ruler of Japan, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, continued to be a central aspect of Japan's political and spiritual identity. The establishment of Hyōkyō as the capital in 710 CE was a bold and strategic move. It was the first time in Japanese history that a permanent capital had been constructed, and its location was chosen to symbolize the unification and centralization of power. The city was laid out according to the principles of Chinese urban planning, with wide streets, carefully designed government buildings, and a grand imperial palace. Hyōkyō was designed to be both the political and cultural heart of the nation, and it became the center of religious and intellectual activity. The city's grandeur reflected the aspirations of the Japanese court to emulate the sophisticated civilizations of China and Korea. This period also saw the creation of the first Japanese legal codes, including the Taihyo Code of 701 CE, which provided the legal framework for the imperial government and helped to define the role of the emperor and the court. Buddhism, which had been introduced to Japan during the Asuka period, continued to play a major role in the Nara period. The religion was no longer just a foreign influence. It had become deeply integrated into the fabric of Japanese society and politics. Buddhist temples were built throughout the capital, and the emperor himself took an active role in promoting Buddhism. One of the most significant developments of the Nara period was the construction of Todaiji, a massive Buddhist temple that housed a giant bronze statue of the Buddha. Todaiji became a symbol of the growing influence of Buddhism and the close relationship between religion and politics in Japan. The temple's construction was also a monumental achievement in terms of architecture and engineering, as it was the largest wooden structure in the world at the time. The influence of Buddhism extended beyond religious practices. It also shaped the arts, with Buddhist themes and motifs becoming central to Japanese art during this period. The relationship between the emperor and Buddhism grew even closer during the Nara period, as the imperial family increasingly relied on the religion for political legitimacy and divine favor. In addition to Buddhism, Confucianism and Chinese legal thought continued to influence Japan during the Nara period. The Japanese court adopted many of the Confucian principles of governance, which emphasized the importance of filial piety, loyalty, and order. Confucian ideals were incorporated into the legal system, and they helped to reinforce the emperor's authority as the central figure in Japanese society. The Chinese model of centralized governance, which had been brought to Japan by diplomatic missions during the Asuka period, became the blueprint for the Nara government. The imperial court established a highly structured bureaucracy, with a complex system of ranks and offices for government officials. This system was designed to ensure that the emperor's will was carried out throughout the country and that the court's authority was respected by all. The Nara period also saw significant developments in Japanese literature. The first works of Japanese written literature were produced during this time, and they were deeply influenced by Chinese literary traditions. One of the most important texts from this period is the Nihon Shoki, Chronicles of Japan, which was completed in 720 CE. The Nihon Shoki is one of the earliest historical records of Japan, and it presents a mythological and historical account of Japan's origins, from the creation of the world to the reign of Emperor Jammu, the legendary first emperor of Japan. The text is heavily influenced by Chinese historiography, and it reflects the growing influence of Chinese culture on Japan. Another important text from the Nara period is the Kojiki, Record of Ancient Matters, which was completed in 712 CE. The Kojiki is a collection of myths, legends, and historical accounts that traces the origins of Japan and the imperial family. Both the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki are essential sources for understanding the cultural and religious foundations of Japan. The development of Japanese art during the Nara period was closely linked to both Buddhism and Chinese influence. Buddhist temples and statues were some of the most significant works of art from this time, and they often depicted Buddhist deities and scenes from Buddhist teachings. The art of the Nara period was highly stylized and symbolic, with an emphasis on religious and philosophical themes. The famous bronze statue of the great Buddha at Todaiji is perhaps the most iconic example of Nara period art, and it stands as a testament to the growing importance of Buddhism in Japanese society. In addition to Buddhist art, the Nara period saw the development of other forms of artistic expression, including calligraphy, pottery, and textiles. The influence of Chinese art and culture was evident in many of these works, but over time Japanese artists began to adapt and develop their own distinctive styles. Despite the many advancements made during the Nara period, the centralized government that had been established in the early part of the period began to face challenges. The bureaucratic system, while efficient on paper, was difficult to maintain in practice, especially as the country expanded. Local aristocratic families and regional clans began to exert more influence, challenging the authority of the central government. This decentralization of power, along with the growing influence of Buddhism and other religious movements, contributed to a sense of instability in the late Nara period. By the end of the Nara period, Japan was on the brink of a new era. The capital of Heian-kyo was eventually abandoned in favor of a new capital at Heian-kyo, modern-day Kyoto, which marked the beginning of the Heian period. The Heian period, which would begin in 1794 CE, would see the rise of a new, more refined culture, but also the beginning of the decline of the central government. Despite the challenges faced in the later years of the Nara period, it remains one of the most important periods in Japanese history, as it set the stage for the political, cultural, and religious developments that would shape Japan for centuries to come. The Heian period, spanning from 1794 to 1195 CE, represents one of the most culturally rich and transformative eras in Japanese history. This period is often seen as the zenith of classical Japanese culture, marked by the flourishing of art, literature, and philosophy. The capital city, Heian-kyo, modern-day Kyoto, was established as the new center of political and cultural life, and it would remain the imperial capital for over 1,000 years. The Heian period is famous for its aesthetic achievements, the development of a unique and refined courtly culture, and the gradual decline of the centralized government that had been established during the Nara period. It was a time when Japan's aristocracy became increasingly powerful, and the political and military dynamics shifted in ways that would set the stage for the rise of the samurai. The foundation of the Heian period began with the relocation of the capital to Heian-kyo in 1794 CE, a move that was intended to distance the imperial court from the religious and political influence that had grown in Nara. The decision to build the new capital was motivated in part by the desire to create a more independent and secular government, one that would be free from the religious and political pressures exerted by powerful Buddhist monasteries. Heian-kyo was designed to reflect the grandeur and sophistication of Chinese capitals, but it also incorporated indigenous Japanese elements, marking the beginning of a distinctly Japanese urban planning style. The city was meticulously planned, with its grand imperial palace at the center, surrounded by elegant gardens, shrines, and aristocratic estates. It became the heart of political, religious, and cultural life, where the imperial court would grow in both influence and opulence. At the core of Heian society was the imperial court, which had become increasingly dominated by the aristocracy. During the early Heian period, the emperor's role was still seen as the highest authority in Japan, but over time power began to shift toward the noble families who controlled the court. These aristocratic families, particularly the powerful Fujiwara clan, became key players in the political landscape, often intermarrying with the imperial family to secure their positions of power. The Fujiwara clan effectively controlled the imperial court for much of the Heian period, exercising their influence behind the scenes by marrying their daughters to emperors and placing their own relatives in key government positions. As a result, the emperor's power became more symbolic, and the real political authority shifted into the hands of the court aristocracy. Despite the growing influence of the aristocracy, the imperial court remained the cultural center of Japan. The court was home to an elite group of individuals who valued elegance, refinement, and artistic expression. This emphasis on culture and beauty gave rise to one of the most distinctive periods in Japanese history, where art, poetry, literature, and music flourished. One of the most notable characteristics of Heian culture was its preoccupation with aesthetics. Courtly life was characterized by an obsession with beauty, from the elaborate clothing worn by the aristocracy to the carefully crafted gardens and palaces in which they lived. The court elite engaged in activities such as writing poetry, composing music, and practicing calligraphy, all of which were seen as essential skills for members of the nobility. The court's fascination with beauty and sophistication would become a hallmark of the Heian period, influencing everything from literature to fashion. The most significant cultural achievement of the Heian period was the development of a uniquely Japanese style of literature. One of the most famous works from this time is the tale of Genji, Genji Monogatari, written by the noblewoman Murasake Shikibu in the early 11th century. This epic novel is often considered the world's first novel, and is one of the most important works of classical Japanese literature. The tale of Genji tells the story of the life and loves of Hikaru Genji, a nobleman at the Heian court. The novel explores themes of love, loss, and the impermanence of life, and it provides a vivid portrayal of the intricate and often tragic relationships within the courtly world. Through the tale of Genji, Murasake Shikibu captured the essence of Heian court life, its beauty and its melancholy, and created a work that continues to be celebrated for its literary achievements. Another important work from the Heian period is the Pillow Book, Makora no Soshi, by Sei Shonagon, another lady-in-waiting at the imperial court. The Pillow Book is a collection of essays, anecdotes, and reflections on court life, providing a glimpse into the world of the Heian aristocracy. Sei Shonagon's writing is witty, playful, and filled with sharp observations about the people and customs of the time. Unlike the tale of Genji, which focuses on the emotional and personal lives of its characters, the Pillow Book is more concerned with the aesthetic details of everyday life at court. Both of these works, along with others written by the court's elite, helped to establish a literary tradition that would shape Japan's cultural identity for centuries to come. While the Heian period was a time of great cultural achievement, it was also a period of political instability. As the aristocracy grew more powerful, the imperial court became increasingly disconnected from the realities of life outside the capital. The central government's control over the provinces began to weaken, and local aristocratic families and military leaders began to assert more authority. The rise of provincial military clans marked the beginning of a shift in the political landscape of Japan, and the increasing power of these clans would eventually lead to the downfall of the imperial system in the late Heian period. One of the most important developments of the late Heian period was the rise of the samurai, a warrior class that would go on to play a central role in Japanese history. The samurai were originally hired by noble families to protect their lands and interests, but over time they began to gain more political power. This was partly due to the growing instability in the countryside, where bandits and rebellious factions began to challenge the authority of the imperial government. The samurai, with their military training and discipline, emerged as the enforcers of order in a chaotic and decentralized society. While the court continued to focus on culture and refinement, the samurai began to shape the future of Japan through their military and political influence. By the late 12th century, the power of the samurai had grown to the point where they could no longer be ignored. In 1185 CE, after a long period of conflict known as the Genpei War, the samurai clans led by the Minamoto family defeated their rivals, the Taya clan, and established the first military government, known as the Kamakura shogunate. This marked the end of the Heian period and the beginning of the feudal era in Japan. The rise of the samurai and the establishment of the shogunate would forever alter the course of Japanese history, shifting the focus of power from the imperial court to the military leaders who would rule Japan for the next several centuries. In many ways, the Heian period laid the cultural and intellectual foundations for Japan's future. The development of Japanese literature, art, and aesthetics during this time would continue to influence the country's culture for generations. Although the Heian period saw the decline of centralized political power, it was also a time of unparalleled cultural achievement, when Japan's aristocracy created a world of beauty, refinement, and sophistication that still resonates in Japanese culture today. As Japan entered the Kamakura period, the political power of the imperial court waned, but the cultural legacy of the Heian period lived on, shaping the nation's identity for centuries to come. The Kamakura period, which spanned from 1195 to 1333 CE, marks a dramatic shift in Japan's political landscape, as the warrior class, the samurai, took center stage. This era was defined by the rise of the samurai as the dominant force in Japanese society, the establishment of Japan's first military government, the shogunate, and the beginning of the feudal system that would shape the country for centuries. The Kamakura period was also a time of social upheaval, as power shifted from the imperial court and the aristocracy to the military elite. It was a period of both political transformation and cultural change, one that would set the foundation for the development of Japan's medieval society. The period's foundation was laid with the conclusion of the Genpei War, a brutal conflict between two powerful samurai clans, the Minamoto and the Taira. The war lasted from 1180 to 1185 CE and culminated in the decisive Battle of Dan no Ura, where the Minamoto clan, led by Minamoto no Yoritomo, defeated the Taira clan and effectively ended their influence over Japan. The victory of the Minamoto marked the beginning of the Kamakura period and the establishment of the first shogunate, a military government that would wield power over Japan for the next 7 centuries. With the defeat of the Taira, the Minamoto family became the undisputed rulers of Japan, though they chose not to claim the title of emperor. Instead, they established a dual system of government. The emperor would remain the symbolic head of state, while the shogun, a military leader, would hold the real power. Minamoto no Yoritomo, the first shogun, established his base of power in Kamakura, a city located to the east of Kyoto, the capital. Kamakura's location was strategic. It was distant enough from the imperial court in Kyoto to allow the Minamoto family to assert their independence, yet close enough to maintain control over the central regions of Japan. Yoritomo set up a military government in Kamakura, with a system of regional military leaders known as shugo, and local land stewards called jito. These officials were responsible for maintaining order and collecting taxes in their respective areas, and they were directly loyal to the shogunate. This decentralized system of governance was the foundation of the feudal system in Japan, where land was granted in exchange for military service, and where power was increasingly concentrated in the hands of the samurai. At the heart of the Kamakura shogunate was the samurai, who emerged as the ruling class of Japan. The samurai were warriors bound by a code of loyalty, honor, and duty. The samurai's way of life, known as Bushido, emphasized bravery, loyalty to one's lord and personal honor, as well as a deep commitment to martial skills. This code of conduct became a defining feature of the samurai, and would continue to influence Japanese society for centuries. The samurai were not only warriors but also landowners, and their social status was based on their ability to defend and manage land. As the Kamakura shogunate expanded its control over Japan, the samurai became increasingly involved in both the administration and defense of the country, solidifying their role as the dominant class. While the rise of the samurai and the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate represented a shift in power, the period was not without its challenges. One of the most significant challenges faced by the shogunate was the Mongol invasions in the late 13th century. In 1274 and again in 1281, the Mongols, led by Kublai Khan, launched 2 large-scale invasions of Japan, with the goal of bringing the island nation under Mongol rule. Both invasions were ultimately unsuccessful, largely due to the fierce resistance of the samurai and, perhaps more importantly, the intervention of a powerful storm, known as the kamikaze, or divine wind, which destroyed much of the Mongol fleet. The Mongol invasions were a defining moment in Japanese history, as they marked the first time that Japan faced a serious external threat from a foreign power. Despite the shogunate's success in repelling the Mongols, the invasions placed a heavy financial burden on Japan and exposed weaknesses in the Kamakura government's ability to maintain control over the country. The Mongol invasions also had a profound impact on Japanese society and culture. The samurai, who had long been focused on internal struggles and the defense of their own territories, were now called upon to defend Japan from a foreign enemy. This shift in focus led to the strengthening of the samurai's martial traditions, as well as the development of new tactics and strategies for defending against foreign invaders. In the aftermath of the invasions, the samurai became even more revered as protectors of Japan, and their status in society was further solidified. The experience of repelling the Mongols also fostered a sense of national unity and pride, as Japan had successfully resisted one of the most powerful empires in the world. However, the challenges faced by the Kamakura shogunate were not limited to foreign invasions. Domestically, the shogunate faced growing discontent among the samurai and other social classes. As the years passed, the shogunate's ability to maintain control over the country began to weaken, and local samurai and aristocratic families began to assert their own power. The shogunate was also burdened by internal conflicts and corruption within its own ranks. One of the most significant factors contributing to the decline of the Kamakura shogunate was the rise of the Gokunin vassals who had once been loyal to the Minamoto clan, but who began to challenge the authority of the shogunate. These powerful vassals, along with the growing power of the imperial court, began to erode the stability of the Kamakura government. The growing dissatisfaction with the Kamakura shogunate culminated in the Kenmu Restoration of 33 CE. In that year, Emperor Go-Daigo, who had grown frustrated with the shogunate's inability to govern effectively, led a revolt against the ruling shogun Kamakura's Hojo clan. The revolt was successful, and the Hojo clan was overthrown. However, the restoration of imperial rule was short-lived, as Go-Daigo's attempts to reassert imperial power were met with resistance from the samurai. The imperial court's brief reign was followed by the establishment of a new military government, the Ashikaga shogunate, marking the end of the Kamakura period and the beginning of the Muromachi period. The Kamakura period, despite its eventual decline, was a crucial period in Japanese history. It was the time when the samurai emerged as the dominant force in Japanese society, and it laid the foundation for the feudal system that would continue to shape the country for centuries. The Kamakura shogunate's establishment of military rule marked the shift away from the aristocratic court-based politics of the Heian period, and the rise of a warrior-led society that would define Japan's medieval history. In the end, the Kamakura period's legacy would be felt long after its fall, as the samurai's influence and the feudal system would continue to shape Japan's political and social structures for generations to come. The Muromachi period, which lasted from 3036 to 1573 CE, was a time of significant political, social, and cultural change in Japan. This period saw the rise of the Ashikaga shogunate, which replaced the Kamakura shogunate, and it was marked by widespread instability, military conflict, and the eventual fragmentation of Japan into warring states. While the Muromachi period began with the promise of centralized rule under the Ashikaga family, it soon gave way to a time of intense internal strife, as various regional lords, daimyo, sought to expand their power and control over different parts of the country. The period is often seen as a transitional phase between the end of the medieval era and the early modern period in Japanese history, with important developments in the political and cultural realms that would shape the future of the nation. The Muromachi period began in 1336, following the fall of the Kamakura shogunate and the brief restoration of imperial power under Emperor Go-Daigo. The emperor's attempts to reassert imperial control were quickly undermined by the military leader Ashikaga Takauji, a general who had initially supported the imperial cause. However, Takauji soon turned against Go-Daigo and declared his own rule, establishing the Ashikaga shogunate. Takauji's decision to support the imperial family in the beginning of the revolt was driven by his own ambitions for power. Once he gained control of the capital, he established a new shogunate centered in Muromachi, a district in Kyoto. The new shogunate, also known as the Ashikaga shogunate, would rule Japan for more than 2 centuries. The Ashikaga family's rise to power marked the beginning of a new era in Japanese history, but it also set the stage for instability. The Ashikaga shogunate was far less centralized than its predecessors, and it struggled to maintain control over the powerful regional lords, or daimyo, who had grown more independent during the Kamakura period. These local lords controlled vast swathes of land and maintained private armies of samurai, and they were more than willing to challenge the authority of the shogunate when it suited their interests. As a result, the central government in Kyoto was often weak and ineffective, unable to assert its authority over the growing power of the daimyo. One of the key features of the Muromachi period was the rise of the samurai as the dominant force in Japanese politics. During this time, samurai clans began to carve out their own territories, and regional warfare became a common occurrence. The samurai, once loyal to the shogunate, became increasingly loyal to their local lords, who provided them with land, status, and power in exchange for military service. This created a highly fragmented political landscape, with various samurai factions and daimyo constantly vying for control. As the central authority of the Ashikaga shogunate weakened, the daimyo began to exercise more power, leading to an era of conflict that would later be known as the Sengoku period, or the Age of Warring States. The Sengoku period, which began in the mid-15th century and lasted until the early 17th century, was one of the most tumultuous times in Japanese history. During this period, Japan was divided into numerous feudal domains, each controlled by a powerful daimyo who fought for dominance over the others. The samurai, once loyal to the Ashikaga shogunate, became increasingly independent and warlike, with military alliances and rivalries forming and breaking apart as the daimyo sought to expand their territories. This era of constant warfare and shifting allegiances created a chaotic and unstable environment, with frequent battles and power struggles that affected both the military elite and the common people. While the Sengoku period was a time of warfare and instability, it also saw important cultural and economic developments. The constant movement of armies and the expansion of trade routes brought about increased contact between Japan and foreign countries. During this period, the Portuguese arrived in Japan in 1543, marking the beginning of European influence on Japanese society. The Portuguese brought firearms with them, which revolutionized warfare in Japan and gave the daimyo a new technological advantage. The introduction of firearms, such as muskets, fundamentally changed the nature of samurai warfare, leading to the rise of more modern military strategies and tactics. In addition to the introduction of firearms, the Sengoku period also saw the spread of Christianity in Japan. Jesuit missionaries, led by the Italian missionary Francis Xavier, arrived in Japan in the mid-16th century and began to convert Japanese people to Christianity. The missionaries were welcomed by some daimyo, who saw the potential benefits of an alliance with European powers. The spread of Christianity and the influence of European culture had a profound impact on Japan, introducing new ideas, technologies, and trade goods to the country. However, Christianity's growth in Japan was short-lived, as the Tokugawa shogunate, which would come to power in the early 17th century, would later enforce a policy of isolationism and persecute Christians. Amid the chaos of the Sengoku period, the Ashikaga shogunate began to lose its grip on power. The shogunate's inability to maintain control over the daimyo and its failure to resolve internal conflicts led to widespread dissatisfaction with Ashikaga rule. In the late 16th century, powerful daimyo like Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu began to emerge as the dominant military leaders, each one seeking to unify Japan under their rule. These warlords, often referred to as the Three Unifiers, led efforts to centralize power and end the constant warfare that had plagued Japan for decades. The efforts of these men would culminate in the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603, ending the Sengoku period and bringing about a new era of stability and peace. Despite the eventual collapse of the Ashikaga shogunate, the Muromachi period left a lasting legacy on Japanese culture and society. It was during this period that many of Japan's most well-known cultural traditions, such as the tea ceremony, no theater, and ink painting, began to take shape. The Muromachi period was a time of great artistic and intellectual ferment, as the turbulence of the political landscape gave rise to new forms of artistic expression. The Zen Buddhist influence on art and culture became particularly pronounced during this time, with many of the period's greatest works of art reflecting Zen ideals of simplicity, austerity, and impermanence. One of the most important cultural developments of the Muromachi period was the rise of the tea ceremony. The tea ceremony, which became formalized during this period, was a meditative ritual centered around the preparation and consumption of matcha, powdered green tea. The ceremony was influenced by Zen Buddhism, emphasizing mindfulness, simplicity, and the beauty of imperfection. The tea ceremony would become one of Japan's most enduring cultural traditions, and it continues to play a central role in Japanese society today. In conclusion, the Muromachi period was a time of political upheaval, cultural innovation, and military conflict. The rise of the Ashikaga shogunate, followed by the fragmentation of Japan into warring states, created a period of instability that would have lasting effects on Japanese society. However, it was also a time of great cultural achievement, as new artistic and philosophical traditions emerged that continue to shape Japan's identity. The political fragmentation and warfare of the Sengoku period would eventually lead to the unification of Japan under powerful warlords, bringing an end to the chaos of the Muromachi period and setting the stage for the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate and the peaceful Edo period that would follow. The Azuchi Momoyama period, which spanned from 1573 to 1603 CE, was a brief but crucial chapter in Japanese history, defined by the unification of the country under powerful warlords after a century of warfare and political fragmentation. This period saw the emergence of two of Japan's most famous and influential figures, Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Their efforts to bring Japan under a single rule ended the chaos of the Sengoku period and paved the way for the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 17th century. Despite its relatively short duration, the Azuchi Momoyama period was a time of dramatic change in Japan's political, military, and cultural landscapes. The period's foundation was laid by Oda Nobunaga, a brilliant and ambitious military leader who emerged as one of the most powerful figures in Japan during the late 16th century. Nobunaga's rise to power began in the 1560s when he seized control of the Oda clan, one of the many regional warlord families fighting for dominance in Japan. His military genius, combined with his ruthless determination, quickly made him a force to be reckoned with. Nobunaga's strategy of using modern firearms and innovative tactics gave him a significant advantage over his enemies, and he was able to achieve several decisive victories. One of his most famous battles was the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, where he decisively defeated the Takeda clan using muskets in a coordinated volley fire, marking one of the first major uses of firearms in Japanese warfare. Nobunaga's military successes allowed him to expand his power and control large portions of Japan, but his ultimate goal was to unify the country under his leadership. His approach to achieving this goal was twofold. First, he sought to eliminate his rivals, and second, he worked to consolidate power by forming alliances with other influential families. One of the key elements of Nobunaga's strategy was his ability to adapt to changing circumstances. He was not bound by traditional alliances or customs, and he was willing to ally with former enemies if it served his purposes. In this way, Nobunaga was able to build a broad coalition of powerful samurai families, which helped him expand his control over much of central Japan. Despite his many achievements, Oda Nobunaga's reign was cut short by betrayal. In 1582, one of his most trusted generals, Akachi Mitsuhide, turned against him and led a coup against Nobunaga at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto. Nobunaga was forced to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, to avoid capture. His death marked the end of his reign and the beginning of a power struggle between his successors. Nobunaga's sudden demise left a power vacuum that would soon be filled by his loyal general Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who had been one of his closest allies and military commanders. Hideyoshi's rise to power was both remarkable and improbable. Born to a peasant family, Hideyoshi had started his career as a low-ranking foot soldier, but his talents as a strategist and administrator helped him climb the ranks. After Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi quickly consolidated power, defeating his rivals and securing his position as the most powerful warlord in Japan. In 1590, Hideyoshi completed the unification of Japan when he forced the Hojo clan, one of the last remaining powerful families opposing him, to surrender. This victory marked the end of the Sengoku period and the start of a relatively peaceful era, as Hideyoshi succeeded in bringing most of Japan under a single authority. Hideyoshi's reign, though brief, was marked by several significant reforms that had lasting effects on Japanese society and government. One of his most important actions was the implementation of the katana ken policy, which required samurai to turn in their swords and register them with the government. This move was designed to reduce the power of the samurai class and centralize control under Hideyoshi's rule. He also initiated land surveys to determine the wealth of his subjects and redistribute land to reward his loyal followers. The land surveys and land redistribution strengthened Hideyoshi's control over Japan's economy and created a more centralized and organized system of governance. Another key event during Hideyoshi's rule was his invasion of Korea in the late 1590s. Hideyoshi, eager to expand Japan's influence and secure a greater legacy, launched two military campaigns against the Korean peninsula in 1592 and 1597. While his armies were initially successful, the invasions ultimately failed, and Japan's forces were driven back. The failure of the invasions weakened Hideyoshi's position, and it also left Japan facing a number of economic and social challenges. Despite his successes in unifying Japan, Hideyoshi's efforts to expand Japan's territory abroad had largely been disastrous, and his reign was overshadowed by the costly and unsuccessful military campaigns. Hideyoshi's death in 1598 created yet another power vacuum in Japan. Although Hideyoshi had designated his young son Toyotomi Hideyoshi as his successor, the true power in Japan rested with a council of regents and generals. Among these leaders was Tokugawa Ieyasu, a former ally of Hideyoshi, who quickly maneuvered to secure his own position of power. In 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu defeated his rivals at the Battle of Sekigahara, a decisive confrontation that effectively ended the power struggle between the major warlords. This victory allowed Ieyasu to establish the Tokugawa shogunate, which would rule Japan for more than 250 years, bringing the Azuchi Momoyama period to a close. The Azuchi Momoyama period, while short, was a transformative time in Japanese history. It was during this period that Japan was finally unified after more than a century of warfare and fragmentation. Oda Nobunaga's and Toyotomi Hideyoshi's efforts laid the foundation for the stability and peace that would come under the Tokugawa shogunate. The military strategies, political reforms, and cultural developments of this time helped shape Japan's future. While the period was marked by warfare and political intrigue, it was also a time of significant cultural achievements. The Azuchi Momoyama period saw the rise of new artistic forms, such as the development of tea ceremonies, no theater, and traditional Japanese painting, which reflected the tastes and values of the ruling warrior class. The architecture of the period, particularly the construction of grand castles like Oda Nobunaga's Azuchi Castle and Toyotomi Hideyoshi's Osaka Castle, symbolized the power and grandeur of the unifying warlords. These castles were not only military strongholds but also expressions of the wealth, status, and ambition of the leaders who built them. The period also saw the flourishing of the wabi-sabi aesthetic, which emphasized the beauty of imperfection and transience. This aesthetic would influence Japanese art and culture for centuries to come. In conclusion, the Azuchi Momoyama period was a pivotal time in Japanese history, one that marked the end of the Sengoku period and the unification of Japan under powerful warlords. The efforts of Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu brought Japan out of a century of warfare and chaos, and set the stage for the long period of peace and stability under the Tokugawa shogunate. The political and cultural developments of this time would continue to shape Japan's history for generations, influencing everything from military strategy to art, architecture, and social structures. The legacy of the Azuchi Momoyama period remains an essential chapter in the story of Japan's rise as a unified nation. The Tokugawa period, also known as the Edo period, was a time of remarkable stability and isolation in Japan's history. It began in 1603 with the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate by Tokugawa Ieyasu, following his victory in the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, and it lasted until 1868, when the Meiji Restoration brought an end to centuries of feudal rule. This period is one of the longest periods of political stability in Japanese history, lasting more than 250 years. During the Tokugawa period, Japan experienced significant social, cultural, and economic growth, but it also saw the rise of rigid social structures and a policy of isolation from the rest of the world. This chapter will explore the key events and developments of the Tokugawa period, from its establishment to its eventual downfall, and examine how the policies and practices of the Tokugawa shogunate shaped the course of Japanese history. The Tokugawa shogunate was founded by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had been one of the key military leaders during the Sengoku period. After his victory at Sekigahara, Ieyasu was able to secure control of Japan and became the country's supreme ruler. However, Ieyasu understood that maintaining power would require more than just military success. It would also require the creation of a system that could govern Japan effectively and ensure stability. To do this, Ieyasu established a centralized feudal system in which regional lords or daimyo were required to pledge loyalty to the shogunate and follow strict regulations. This system was designed to prevent any one lord from becoming too powerful and threatening the authority of the shogunate. One of the most important policies of the Tokugawa period was the Sankin Kotai system, which required daimyo to spend alternating years at the capital Edo, modern-day Tokyo, and at their own domains. This system kept the daimyo under control by ensuring they could not build up enough power to challenge the shogunate. The daimyo were required to maintain large households in Edo, which meant they had to spend large amounts of their wealth on the upkeep of their estates, limiting their ability to challenge the shogunate's authority. In this way, the Tokugawa shogunate effectively centralized power while also maintaining the loyalty of the regional lords. The Tokugawa period was marked by a relatively peaceful and orderly society. Japan's political stability allowed for the development of a thriving economy, with trade and commerce flourishing both within Japan and with foreign countries. Agriculture also saw significant growth, and new farming techniques were developed that increased food production. This led to the growth of cities and towns, particularly Edo, which became one of the largest cities in the world by the end of the period. The rise of a merchant class and the expansion of the economy contributed to the development of a vibrant culture in Japan, including new forms of entertainment, literature, and art. However, despite its economic successes, the Tokugawa period was also marked by rigid social classes and a system that heavily restricted mobility. Society during this time was divided into four main classes: the samurai, the farmers, the artisans, and the merchants. The samurai were the warrior class, who served as the military backbone of the Tokugawa shogunate. The farmers were the most important class in terms of food production, while the artisans and merchants, although economically powerful, were considered the lowest classes in the social hierarchy. This rigid class system limited the ability of individuals to move between social classes and reinforced the dominance of the samurai and the nobility. One of the defining features of the Tokugawa period was its policy of isolation known as sakoku. For much of the period, Japan was closed off from the rest of the world. Foreign trade was limited to a few specific ports, such as Nagasaki, and only a small number of foreign merchants, primarily from the Netherlands and China, were allowed to trade with Japan. The shogunate's isolationist policies were partly a reaction to the spread of Christianity, which had gained a foothold in Japan during the Azuchi Momoyama period. The Tokugawa shogunate feared that Christianity, along with the influence of European powers, could destabilize Japan's social order and undermine the authority of the shogunate. As a result, the Tokugawa government banned Christianity and persecuted Christians, forcing many to either abandon their faith or practice it in secret. The policy of isolation also had profound effects on Japan's cultural development. While the country was closed off to most foreign influences, this allowed for the flourishing of distinctly Japanese cultural forms. One of the most famous cultural developments of the Tokugawa period was the rise of the ukiyo-e style of painting and woodblock printing. Ukiyo-e, meaning pictures of the floating world, depicted scenes of daily life, landscapes, and famous kabuki actors, and became one of Japan's most celebrated art forms. The Tokugawa period also saw the rise of kabuki theater, a form of popular entertainment that combined drama, music, and dance, and which remains one of Japan's most iconic art forms. The Tokugawa period also saw the development of new literary forms. The haiku, a short form of poetry that focuses on nature and the changing seasons, became one of Japan's most beloved poetic forms during this time. The works of the famous poet Matsuo Basho, who is often considered the master of the haiku, were highly influential in shaping Japanese literature. Novels also became popular during the Tokugawa period, with authors such as Ihara Saikaku and Chikamatsu Monzaemon gaining widespread acclaim for their stories about the lives of common people. The Tokugawa period's focus on art, literature, and entertainment created a rich cultural legacy that continues to influence Japan today. Despite the prosperity and cultural achievements of the Tokugawa period, the system was not without its challenges. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, Japan faced economic problems, including inflation, crop failures, and peasant uprisings. The rigid social structure and the growing disparity between the wealthy merchant class and the struggling farmers contributed to widespread dissatisfaction. Additionally, the isolationist policies of the Tokugawa shogunate led to a lack of technological and scientific advancement, which made Japan increasingly vulnerable to the pressures of the outside world. By the mid-19th century, Japan's isolationist policies were beginning to show cracks. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy arrived in Japan with a fleet of warships, demanding that Japan open its ports to American trade. This marked the beginning of the end for the Tokugawa period, as the shogunate was forced to sign the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854, which opened Japan to foreign trade. This event, known as the Black Ships Incident, led to a series of political, social, and economic upheavals that would culminate in the Meiji Restoration in 1868. The Tokugawa period, despite its eventual downfall, remains one of the most important periods in Japanese history. It was a time of relative peace, cultural growth, and economic prosperity, but also a time of rigidity, isolation, and class inequality. The legacy of the Tokugawa period is still felt today, as many of Japan's cultural traditions and social structures have roots in the policies and practices established by the Tokugawa shogunate. The period's emphasis on order, discipline, and hierarchy, while ultimately unsustainable in the face of modern challenges, played a crucial role in shaping the Japan that emerged in the Meiji era and beyond. The Meiji Restoration, which began in 1868, marked the dawn of a new era in Japanese history. After more than 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule, Japan underwent a radical transformation that would reshape its society, economy, politics, and culture. The collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate and the restoration of imperial rule under Emperor Meiji signified the end of the feudal system and the beginning of Japan's emergence as a modern, industrialized nation. This chapter explores the major events and developments of the Meiji period, from the restoration of imperial power to the transformation of Japan into a global power by the early 20th century. The roots of the Meiji Restoration can be traced back to the mid-19th century when Japan was forced to open its doors to the outside world after over 2 centuries of isolation. The arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry's Black Ships in 1853, with their demands for trade and diplomatic relations, signaled the collapse of Japan's isolationist policies. In the years that followed, Japan's feudal system of government became increasingly vulnerable to internal dissent and external pressure. The Tokugawa shogunate, which had maintained order and stability for over 250 years, struggled to cope with the challenges posed by the foreign powers, and its legitimacy began to erode. Amidst growing dissatisfaction with the shogunate, calls for reform grew louder, especially from the samurai class and other influential factions. The dissatisfaction with Tokugawa rule culminated in the Boshin War, 1868, a civil war between the pro-imperial forces and the Tokugawa shogunate. The imperial forces, made up of a coalition of samurai from domains such as Satsuma, Choshu and Tosa, sought to restore the power of the emperor and end the Tokugawa dynasty's rule. The Tokugawa shogunate, weakened by internal divisions and external pressure, was ultimately defeated, and the last Tokugawa shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, resigned in 1867. In 1868, Emperor Meiji, who had been a figurehead throughout much of the Tokugawa period, was restored to power, and the Meiji Restoration officially began. The restoration of imperial power brought about significant political and social changes. One of the first acts of the new government was to dismantle the feudal system and replace it with a centralized bureaucratic government. The domains controlled by the Tokugawa-era daimyo were abolished, and Japan was divided into prefectures, which were governed by appointed officials. This marked the end of the old feudal order, with the samurai class losing its privileges and status. The government also began to implement reforms that aimed to modernize Japan's political system. In 1889, a new constitution was adopted that established a constitutional monarchy with an elected legislature, while retaining the emperor as the symbolic head of state. The constitution, inspired by Western models, was a significant step in Japan's transformation into a modern nation-state. In addition to political reforms, the Meiji government initiated sweeping changes to Japan's economy. The government implemented policies that promoted industrialization, which would transform Japan into one of the world's leading industrial powers. A key element of this transformation was the development of a modern infrastructure, including railroads, telegraphs, and modern factories. The government also encouraged the growth of heavy industries, such as steel production, shipbuilding, and textiles, and provided financial support to private entrepreneurs to help them build businesses. By the late 19th century, Japan had developed a burgeoning industrial economy, and its factories began to produce goods for both domestic consumption and export. The rapid industrialization of Japan also brought about significant social changes. The rise of factory-based production led to the growth of a new urban working class, while traditional agricultural lifestyles began to decline. With industrialization came the rise of new social classes, such as wealthy industrialists, entrepreneurs, and professionals, while the samurai class was increasingly marginalized. The Meiji government sought to address these changes by implementing educational reforms that aimed to create a more modern and educated society. In 1872, the government established a national system of primary education, which made schooling more accessible to children across Japan. The government also established universities and technical schools that trained students in Western-style science, engineering, and medicine, all crucial for Japan's modernization. Culturally, the Meiji period was a time of dramatic change as Japan sought to blend its traditional heritage with the influences of the West. The government encouraged the study of Western science, technology, and philosophy, while also promoting a sense of national pride and loyalty to the emperor. Western-style architecture, fashion, and art began to appear in Japan's cities, while traditional Japanese arts, such as tea ceremonies, calligraphy, and kabuki theater continued to be valued and preserved. The government also sought to modernize Japan's military, adopting Western military techniques and technology to strengthen Japan's defense capabilities. By the end of the 19th century, Japan had developed a modern Western-style army and navy, which would play a crucial role in its rise as a world power. Japan's growing power and influence were also demonstrated on the international stage. The Meiji government pursued a policy of imperialism, seeking to expand Japan's influence and acquire colonies. In 1895, Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War, gaining control of Taiwan and establishing itself as a major regional power. The victory in the war marked Japan's emergence as a military power and sent a clear message to the Western powers that Japan was no longer an isolated, feudal society, but a modern, industrialized nation. Japan's growing imperial ambitions were further demonstrated when it annexed Korea in 1910, solidifying its position as a dominant force in East Asia. Despite its many successes, the Meiji period was not without its challenges. The rapid pace of modernization brought about significant social and economic upheaval, and many people struggled to adjust to the new realities of industrialized Japan. The country also faced tensions between the desire to maintain traditional cultural values and the need to adopt Western practices and ideas. Additionally, Japan's imperialist ambitions and military expansion would eventually lead to conflict with other powers, setting the stage for the events that would culminate in Japan's involvement in World War II. The Meiji Restoration was a pivotal moment in Japan's history, as it marked the end of centuries of feudal rule and the beginning of Japan's transformation into a modern, industrialized nation. The changes that occurred during this period, from political reforms to economic modernization, laid the foundation for Japan's rise as a world power in the 20th century. Japan's successful blending of Western technology with its traditional cultural values allowed it to become a formidable force on the global stage, and the legacy of the Meiji period continues to influence Japan's development today. The 20th century was a period of dramatic change for Japan, as the country moved from its rise as an imperial power to the devastation of World War II and its subsequent reconstruction. This chapter explores the key events of Japan's history in the 20th century, beginning with the Taisho and early Showa periods, through Japan's involvement in World War II, and finally to its post-war recovery and transformation into an economic powerhouse. These decades marked Japan's emergence as a modern military and industrial power, but they also set the stage for the country's profound defeat and the difficult process of rebuilding. After the death of Emperor Meiji in 1912, his son, Emperor Taisho, ascended to the throne, marking the beginning of the Taisho period. The Taisho era, lasting from 1912 to 1926, was a time of significant social, political, and cultural change in Japan. While Emperor Taisho's reign was marked by his relatively poor health and limited political influence, Japan experienced rapid industrial growth and began to adopt more Western-style institutions. However, this period was also one of increasing political instability, as the country faced economic challenges, social unrest, and the rise of militarism. During the Taisho period, Japan's political system evolved. The Taisho democracy movement, which sought to strengthen the role of the people in government, led to the development of political parties and the expansion of suffrage. By the 1920s, Japan had a parliamentary system with political parties, and universal male suffrage was granted in 1925. Despite these democratic reforms, the rise of militarism in the 1930s would ultimately shift Japan away from democratic ideals and lead to the central role of the military in the country's politics. Economically, Japan's industrialization continued to accelerate during the Taisho period, but the country faced significant challenges. The global economy was hit by the Great Depression, which led to widespread unemployment and economic hardship in Japan. In response, the government turned to militarism as a way to escape economic problems, as well as to secure resources and markets for Japanese industries. This period saw the growing influence of the military in political affairs, and the government began to increasingly focus on expanding Japan's empire. The next major phase in Japan's history came with the reign of Emperor Showa, which began in 1926 and lasted until his death in 1989. The Showa period, which spanned much of the 20th century, was marked by Japan's transformation into a major imperial power, its involvement in World War II, and the post-war rebuilding process. However, the early years of the Showa period saw Japan's rise as a military power, which would ultimately lead to its involvement in the Pacific War, a conflict that would change the country forever. The 1930s were a time of intense militarization in Japan. The rise of nationalism and militarism in the country led to the military playing an increasingly central role in politics. Japan's leaders began to advocate for an aggressive foreign policy, seeking to expand Japan's territory in Asia and the Pacific. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a region in northeastern China, and established a puppet state known as Manchukuo. This invasion was condemned by the international community, but was part of Japan's broader strategy to secure resources and establish dominance in Asia. In 1937, Japan escalated its invasion of China, launching a full-scale war against the Chinese nationalist government. The Second Sino-Japanese War was brutal, with atrocities such as the Nanjing Massacre, in which Japanese forces killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. The war further cemented Japan's imperial ambitions in Asia and demonstrated the increasing militarization of the country. The expansionist policies of Japan created tension with Western powers, particularly the United States, which had been critical of Japan's actions in China and Manchuria. The tensions between Japan and the West eventually led to Japan's decision to join the Axis powers, alongside Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, during World War II. In December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, bringing the United States into the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor marked the beginning of Japan's involvement in the Pacific War, a conflict that would have catastrophic consequences for Japan and the rest of the world. During the Pacific War, Japan sought to expand its empire across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, but the tide of the war quickly turned against Japan. The United States and its allies began to push back, and Japan's military was stretched thin. The Battle of Midway in 1942 marked a decisive turning point in the war, as the United States dealt a crippling blow to Japan's navy. Over the next few years, the Allies launched a series of successful campaigns to recapture territory from Japan and to bring the war to Japan's doorstep. As the war continued, Japan's cities were subjected to intense bombing campaigns. The United States dropped devastating firebombs on cities such as Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe, causing widespread destruction and killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing unprecedented destruction and loss of life. The bombings, combined with Japan's inability to continue the war, led to Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, effectively bringing an end to World War II. Japan's defeat in World War II marked a turning point in its history. The country was left devastated, with much of its infrastructure destroyed and its economy in ruins. Under the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, Japan was occupied by Allied forces, led by the United States. The occupation lasted from 1945 to 1952 and was overseen by General Douglas MacArthur, who became the supreme commander for the Allied powers, SCEP. During the occupation, Japan underwent profound political, social, and economic reforms. The Japanese Emperor, Hirohito, was retained as a symbolic figurehead, but his power was greatly reduced, and a new constitution was enacted in 1947. Which established a democratic government and renounced war as a means of settling disputes. In addition to political reforms, Japan's economy was also rebuilt with the assistance of the United States. The post-war period saw the emergence of Japan as one of the world's leading industrial powers. The Korean War, 1950–1953, played a crucial role in Japan's economic recovery, as the United States relied on Japan for supplies and manufacturing during the conflict. Japan's industrial output grew rapidly, and by the 1960s and 1970s, Japan had become a major economic powerhouse, exporting cars, electronics, and other products to markets around the world. The legacy of Japan's imperialist ambitions, its involvement in World War II, and the subsequent occupation and reconstruction shaped the country's development in the second half of the 20th century. Japan emerged from the ashes of war as a peaceful democratic nation, and its rapid economic recovery in the post-war years was nothing short of remarkable. However, the scars of war and Japan's imperial past would continue to affect its relationships with its neighbors and the rest of the world, influencing Japan's foreign policy and its role on the global stage for decades to come. Japan's history stretches back thousands of years, beginning with the early mythological tales of gods and the formation of the first societies. Over time, Japan evolved from small tribal communities into a unified nation with strong cultural traditions and religious beliefs. The ancient Japanese were influenced by nearby cultures, particularly China and Korea, which helped shape their writing systems, arts, and religious practices. The first major periods of Japan's history were the Yayoi and Kofun periods, roughly from 300 BCE to 710 CE. During this time, Japan saw the rise of powerful clans and the introduction of agriculture, which allowed society to grow and develop. The Kofun period was marked by the construction of large burial mounds for the elites and the spread of early Japanese mythology. In the Nara period, 710–794 CE, Japan established its first permanent capital in Nara. This era saw the creation of Japan's first written records, and Buddhism became a significant part of Japanese life. The Heian period 710–485 CE followed, and Japan's imperial court flourished in Kyoto. During this time, Japanese culture, art, and literature reached new heights, with the creation of masterpieces like The Tale of Genji. However, the power of the emperor weakened as military leaders, known as samurai, began to gain more influence. The next major phase in Japan's history was the Kamakura period, 1195–1333 CE, which saw the rise of the first shogunate, a military government that ruled Japan. The samurai became the dominant force in Japanese politics, and Japan also faced invasions from Mongol forces. Although the Mongols were eventually repelled, the Kamakura shogunate eventually fell, leading to the Muromachi period, 1336–1573 CE, a time of civil war and regional conflicts known as the Sengoku era. This was the age of powerful warlords, or daimyo, and samurai warriors. By the time Japan entered the Edo period, 1603–1868 CE, the Tokugawa shogunate established a long period of peace and stability. Japan closed itself off from the outside world during this time, focusing on internal development and trade. However, when foreign powers like the United States forced Japan to open up in the mid-1800s, this led to the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate and the rise of the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Under Emperor Meiji, Japan rapidly modernized its economy, military and government, adopting Western ideas and technologies to become a world power. The Meiji period set the stage for Japan's imperial ambitions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Japan expanded its territory through wars and colonization, particularly in Korea and China, and became involved in World War II by aligning with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 led to its involvement in the Pacific War, which ended with Japan's defeat in 1945 after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The country was occupied by the United States after the war, leading to the creation of a new democratic government and the rebuilding of Japan's economy. By the mid-20th century, Japan emerged as one of the world's leading economic powers, with its rapid industrial growth and technological advancements. Today, Japan is a peaceful, prosperous country with a rich cultural heritage, balancing tradition and modernity.